Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So, nice to see everybody here today, our Tuesday meditation in our classic room here. And so now I have to, we're going to switch it up, and so no chanting, which means that I have to talk for, for double the time maybe, I don't know. So we'll see. There's kind of these famous stories in the Thai tradition where, especially with Ajahn Chah, you kind of never knew how long you were going to give a talk for. And so there's this story where he had Ajahn, there'd be all these monks and they would sit in a line. And then he'd look up and down the line and all the monks would be like this, like not me. And then sometimes his finger would land, on one monk. And he'd be like, okay, you give the talk. And so you never knew who it was going to be. And one time he asked Ajahn Sumedho, now call him Longpor Sumedho, to give the talk. And he'd given the talk many times. Actually, there's a couple funny stories that I've heard about his experiences giving talks with Ajahn Chah. And at this particular time, he said, okay, Sumedho, you give a talk, 1 hour. So I think he gave the talk, and he wanted him to give the talk in Thai. And so at that time, Ajahn Sumedho didn't speak much Thai. So I can imagine what that'd be like. Trying to learn Sinhalese is kind of okay. Bhavana Karana Hondai. Happy Bhavana Karana Puluwan. You don't know what to say after that. It's kind of, you're running out of words to say. By the way, that meant meditation is good. We can meditate. So that shows you. In any event, they asked Longpor Sumedho to give this talk for, Ajahn Chah asked Ajahn Sumedho to give a talk for an hour. And when the hour was up, he said, okay, give a talk for another hour. And so then he gave a talk for another hour, and then maybe like half the people left. And then he said, okay, give a talk for another hour. So now it's going on like 3 hours that he has to give a talk, so he did that. And I think he ended up having to give talks for like 4 or 5 hours, And he said by the end of the talk, there was just these 2 or 3 ladies there, they have these grannies who are very devout, and they'll stay for your talk, even if they're sleeping. And so they were all kind of there nodding and asleep, but that was who was left at the end of the talk. And so this kind of taught him an important lesson, which was basically that, you can't always please the crowd of people when you have a good intention. You have this good intention to give a talk, and, you can't always please a crowd. I'm not sure that's the one he actually said, but what he said was he learned what it was like to see the depths of an audience's reaction to your talk. And kind of, that's about as low as it can go. I mean, any lower, the 3 ladies would have left, and that would be, the end. And this is kind of how it works. Kind of as a monk or as somebody who sets out to do good deeds, we basically don't expect to become famous as a result of doing good deeds. We don't really expect to become popular necessarily as a result of doing good. I mean, doesn't mean we're out to make people hate us, doing, not meditating like, to obstruct other people. But the thing about it is that doing good things often doesn't result in fame. That's just the way it goes. It's kind of you. And developing a skill that leads to good things, this also doesn't result in accolation. I don't know if that's actually a word. It doesn't result in accolades. It doesn't result in acclaim. I think that's that's the right way to say it. In any event, that's usually the way that it goes with these kind of things. Goodness tends to map this way. And so there's this actual phrase in the Dhammapada, which is that the path to gains, and it just says gains. This is in a section where it lists 3 things about gains, offerings, and fame. It says, the path to gains goes one way, the path to nibbana goes another. So knowing this, the wise person, I'm paraphrasing here, cultivates, puts aside gains and cultivates seclusion instead. So you can imagine that when you set out to meditate, you set out to practice, people don't necessarily look at you and say, well, that's really awesome. But the interesting thing is that there's these 2 streams that tend to build. You can notice this in like the world at large. There's this one stream that builds up. These kind of 2 principles peak. They kind of like, one starts high and goes down. Another starts low and goes up. Kind of like a graph. I've never graphed it. But if you did, it would look like an X. And this is a kind of graph, we could call it a pattern, that we notice a lot when we come to practice. Because the things that truly lead to welfare in practice are almost always things that start small and build large. The things that lead to decline in practice are almost always the things that start large and build small. And so this is one of the reasons why I think in almost all religious traditions they have this kind of image of temptation, like of a temptation. You can have everything you want except this one thing. And then the one thing you can't have is the thing you want. So they had this kind of like Garden of Eden in the Christian tradition. And, when I was young, I don't think nowadays, but the schools were very much, it was very much a Christian society at that time. Still not super, wasn't like all over the place, like in your face, so to say, but like when you went to school, you learned these stories. So in that sense, it was a Christian society. And one of the stories that you learn about is this kind of Garden of Eden. It's one of the first parables, or earliest parables you tend to learn about, which is this kind of legend in the Christian tradition where, when God first created people, they were in this really great place. Had this garden, and everything was there, all these really great fruits, and I think they were immortal. And God said, okay, you don't eat that one apple in the garden. The apple's looking really shiny. And then the devil shows up as this snake, which is why in the West, snakes are almost always associated with evil. In Thailand, by the way, they're associated with like, they're in the forest tradition, they're often seen as like good things, these kind of nagas. And in China, I think they're also, these kind of dragons are good luck. But in any event, in the West, they're kind of a bad thing. And so this snake shows up and says, hey, why don't you have a little of that apple? Looks really tasty. And I'm paraphrasing. I don't know what I haven't read that story. I don't think I actually ever read the actual text of the story. I've just been told the story many, many times, or heard it many times. And so in that story, Eve goes and eats the apple and they get kicked out. And that's the end of their stay in the Garden of Eden. And so this parable is something that tends to occur in almost every religious tradition. In the Buddhist tradition, it's usually pretty explicit. It's kind of, it's an actual being. It's not a legend. It's kind of, in the Bible, this is meant to be taken seriously and literally as well. But in the Buddhist tradition, it's these things tend to come up a little bit less legendary. It's actually a being. His name is Mara. Mara means death. And he's the personification of temptation. And what Mara tends to get up to is whenever people are up to something good, he sneaks in there and starts whispering in their ear for them to do things that are not so good. Why don't you, you're striving for enlightenment, you're about to die, why don't you take some food? You could make merit. And he keeps showing up, shows up to monks, he shows up to nuns. Oh, aren't you afraid in the forest? What are you doing here all alone? And, show up to the Buddha will think, is it possible to rule without force? And then he'll show up and be like, you should rule without force. Why don't you become the ruler of the world? That would be great. Don't be a Buddha, be the ruler of the world. And so this kind of temptation, the way that these things graph, is very interesting because Mara's temptations to people, he tempts people who are rich in wholesome qualities with good things. The people who are poor in wholesome qualities, I don't even know if he says anything to them at all. He's kind of got them under his sway. In other words, it's to people like the Buddha, it's to people like the monks and nuns who have renounced all these things that he comes and says, why don't you give up all your striving? Right now you've got enough good qualities. You can get this really great thing. Get this really great, high-paying, you didn't say this job, but give up your spiritual quest, give up your spiritual striving, and, eat a bit of food. Have a bit of a party. Not to say these are evil things. But the interesting thing about this is that these things become possible in a person's mind when they've built up enough wholesome qualities for them to be possible. In other words, these temptations only come up for people when they have what you might call enough parami to make them an actual reality. And so you kind of see that with people who become rich and powerful. That's often when their decline starts. You look at some of these characters, when they were young, it's not like they tended to start out doing really terrible, evil things. Actually, sometimes they had kind of very wholesome qualities. They might have had a lot of effort, not always, by the way, but sometimes. And kind of the classic model of corruption tends to follow this way. These people tended to have kind of wholesome qualities, and they get some power, they get some wealth, and this temptation comes up to use it poorly, to abuse it. And this temptation is always for something that's going to give a lot of immediate satisfaction, a lot of immediate happiness. So I was talking to a fellow actually not long ago, and this particular gentleman had an eating disorder. He had kind of an obsessive compulsive eating disorder, this gentleman. And he was, a big guy. And, he wanted to, just say hello. He wasn't a Buddhist. He just wanted to, come and see what I was about. I guess he'd see me on Facebook. So kind of called the temple and asked if he could meet me. And we talked for a while. And, he seemed like a nice guy. I think he just, wanted to say hello and talk. But since he was young, he said he'd never drank, never done drugs, never partied. But he had this compulsion to eat that he just could not control, couldn't stop, this kind of compulsion to eat. And this is usually the way that these things go. And kind of this compulsion comes up. It can start small at first. This is the way these things graph, a little bit of a sub or whatever. I don't know this fellow's whole story. But addiction in itself tends to graph this way. A little bit of this, not a big problem. Chow it down, there's this overwhelming good feeling. But then the next one is a little less. The next one is a little less. And the more that one consumes of whatever this is, the more one's outside world tends to fall away. So in this case, if a person has an eating disorder, or whatever type of extreme addiction it is, when one starts to do that, at first it's a little bit normal. They might notice their body's getting a little bit big. Eventually they become, medically, obese to the point where it's a medical problem for this person. It's a serious problem for their health. It's a problem for their ability to work. It's a problem for their ability to maintain a job and have a normal, if that person, you couldn't get married. So it was actually kind of sad, that aspect of it. But the way that these things graph is they start out this way with this little temptation. Have a little bite of the apple. Not always. This is in its extreme form, and it keeps going. So at first, that trade-off isn't so big. It's like in a person's mind, it's like I'm trading the apple, for maybe a little bit less good of a garden. There's probably still gardens outside the Garden of Eden that are okay. But then eventually, this kind of thing progresses. I'm going to eat one sub. It's all right. Well, I'm a little bit stressed. I'll eat another sub. That's all right. But eventually, what happens is that this person's external world, the external things that one took for granted in this kind of equation start to fall away. So in other words, the pleasure from the subs, the pleasure from the eating gets less and less. But one's external environment gets worse and worse. And this is the way it is with temptation, with addiction. It graphs this way. It starts big and it goes strong. And this is a pattern that a person can see not just with addictions like eating, but with things like alcohol, things like drugs, whatever it is that gives this immediate hit of sensual pleasure just starts to decline the more a person uses it. Over and over a person uses it, over and over it declines, and one's external world starts to fall away. What this is usually accompanied by that's very interesting is this delusion. This kind of equation tends to be accompanied by a delusion. Not to say that everybody who eats a sub is going to, you know, is going to suffer from a terrible disorder like this, or everybody who drinks beer is going to become an alcoholic. But when we come to meditate, this kind of pattern is something that's very important to notice, because it's the delusions that are present in this pattern that tend to make people make bad choices. Tends to lead people to make decisions that are for their short-term gain but long-term pain, and not to truly see the consequences of that, not to see the potentials of that. And it tends to make people make decisions that are not for their short-term pain, but their long-term gain, not to see the potential benefits of that, not to see where that could lead. So the delusion that tends to underlie these things, especially when one wants to go to grab a little bit of pleasure, is always this kind of, I don't know what you call it, it's like an inchworm, you know? See this inchworm, it kind of inches like this, inches like this, inches like this, inches like this. And the delusion is, it's just one more inch, one more inch, one more inch. But you see these inchworms, they can go a long way. They can go like all the way up trees. Some will drop on your head from different places. And this delusion tends to be accompanied by this. Excuse me. In other words, these kind of temptations that come into the mind, these temptations to do something that one knows is not the best for one's practice, one's meditation, not the best for one's sila, not the best for one's generosity. The temptation that comes from things is always often accompanied by this kind of delusion. It's just going to be for this one time. It will just be this one time. Now on the opposite side, the interesting thing is that fortunately, there is not only qualities that graph this way that start big and keep, you know, going smaller and smaller. There's also qualities that graph the other way. They start smaller and keep going bigger and bigger and bigger. So actually I met this person, you know, I often walk on this underground path, you know, and, you know, in the wintertime especially, there's this kind of heated network of tunnels, which I'm kind of in love with. And was walking down there one time, and I used to wave to one of the fellows who would kind of clean the floors there, and he'd always wave back, you know. And then one time we waved at each other, and he's like, "Hey, you know, are you a monk?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Can we get together for a tea one time?" And I was like, "Yeah, for sure. You know, let's get together for a tea." So we ended up having a tea on the path, you know, on the Tim Hortons near the path. And it turned out he was, this fellow was from the Philippines. I'm not saying his name, so I don't think he would mind me telling his story. But he had a very interesting story. So he was trained to be a nurse in the Philippines, and the schooling there is much more, it's super rigorous. It's kind of, you know, had no idea about this. You have like, they have this whole like co-op portion plus a class portion. And university in the Western world, you can just miss classes whenever you want. I mean, you're paying, you know. But in the Philippines, if you miss a certain number of classes, you like fail the year or something like that. It's like you miss, you know, it's like so harsh. There's so many ways you can fail. And like to pass, it's almost like you're, you know, like a commando, you know. And the people are kind of, you know, it's not as rich of a country, so the people put a lot of wealth or, you know, a lot of their effort will go to sending perhaps their children to school, you know? As opposed to here where, you know, the government, which is excellent, the government will provide for you to go to school, you know, as long as you're a Canadian citizen. So his family had sent him to go to school. He completed his nursing degree and was working as a nurse there, which is, you know, a good job. He's a very kind person. And it turned out that he later told me he was a kind of Protestant Christian. You know, a very nice guy. We got along well. And he had decided one day just to not do his job at this nursing place anymore, and to go work with people in the slums of the Philippines. That's what he did. So he kind of went there and started working with the people in the slums of the Philippines, and worked there for a while. And then he said I think he felt he had a calling to come to Canada. So when I met him, he was working in a bank, kind of as a cleaner. And you could tell maybe there's something a little different about this guy, you know. And he said, I think he was doing it just to see what the situation of the people was like on the bottom level here in Canada. He saw what it was like in the Philippines. He wanted to see how things were for people in the bottom level here in Canada. So he had all these stories. You know, eventually he tried to like stand up for the rights of the workers in his cleaning job. I didn't know this. Apparently the workers in these bank buildings, like you have legislation to get raises, but they don't always get them. And a lot of the people who work there have like English as a second language, and they don't speak it so well. And so it's like a huge handicap. And sometimes the bosses will just take advantage of that, right? You're going to think, well, wait a minute, these are huge banks. You can pay the guy his, 30-cent raise or whatever it is every 6 months, but they didn't get it. So he decided to fight for them there. And he had got them their raise. And they asked him to be their union rep, but he quit. And so I'd be talking to him, and I'd be like, he would tell me his story. Well, I was really impressed, by the way, with his devotion to his cause. And it turned out that his dream was actually to go to Afghanistan and help the poor people there. He went from Philippines to Canada, and then wanted to go to Afghanistan. And this was now a few years ago. We've been friends now for a few years, kind of stay in touch and see each other every once in a while. And amazingly enough, after 3 years, he had met somebody at a charity who'd worked in Afghanistan for 27 years, and he got his money together, and he paid to go. And it's now looking like his dream of going to Afghanistan and working in a charity there might come true. It's all out of nowhere. When you met him, you're like, wait, you just landed, he landed in Canada. He's a family here. He's not a Canadian citizen, But it looks like he'll be getting his citizenship. And then he can travel with a Canadian passport and can fulfill his, mission. And the interesting thing about this fellow is that although he's worked in these, not pleasant circumstances, he's got this education, but, he works at like a sign-making factory, or not a factory. They make these, make the signs for people, for like the Starbucks and all this kind of stuff. And he's a very bright fellow. He's this very bright person to be around. Obviously, working in the slums is not that fun. Just go to the slum is not that. The people in those slums, like they pick food from like piles of garbage. So this is his kind of thing. He wants to go live in the places where the people are the worst, and help the people who are like the worst, like the most forgotten people in the world, which is why I think he wants to go to Afghanistan, which I would not want to go to. But the nice thing about this is, not to get into, as a monk, you don't tend to do those things. That's more part of the Christian tradition, that type of generosity. But certainly appreciate that, his efforts towards generosity in that way, and appreciate him for his good deeds. And when you meet people like this, whatever faith they're of, it doesn't have to be that they're doing something like that. Sometimes you meet people, you see people in, like, if you go to Thailand, these people have like dirt, like some of them are very poor, have like dirt on their faces, and you see some of the houses that, Thailand's now, it's a lovely country, not trying to say every place has their poor areas, And in the poor areas there, people have, it's a tropical country, so you don't need a big house. Here, if you don't have a house, you're going to die within maybe 3 winters. So, the government provides housing for people here. But there you don't need. You can live, with a basic shelter, for most of your life if you want. That's what monks do. And so there in Thailand, what you notice is that there are people who don't have much money. Their needs are getting met. They have a very strong village community around them. But Thailand is called the land of smiles. It's an amazing thing. Everybody, when you go there, everybody's just, a lot of people anyway. I didn't go everywhere there. I went to the places, where there were monks. But these people practice this form of generosity where they give food to monks. That's their practice of generosity. This is the form it takes in Buddhist countries. Typically, they also give to the people at large, especially food. I think in Sri Lanka they have this thing called dansela, where they drive like a car and they just give, looking for people to give food to. They do the same thing. I think probably similar things in Thailand. These free food distribution booths, often set up by private individuals or under the auspices of a temple. And this generosity is practiced in this way there. And wherever you see these people who do this quite a lot, they're very bright people. Even if they're living on the margins of not having all that much. And to say nothing of them, the monks you meet, they come from these poor backgrounds. You think the people there are poor. The monks were even like in, a little bit worse shape, at the time, at these kind of, in the earlier days, at least. The people there had these kind of huts, but the monks, if you go there still, there's one monastery where they try to keep it like it was, and these huts are on stilts, and there's all these, sometimes there's gaps in the boards of the hut, and the hut is it was very small, and then at the top there's these gaps, and so, the wind comes from the bottom of this hut and blows into you, and you're like, oh no, it's so cold. You're from Canada, but yet it's very, very cold there. And yet again, these are the areas where the most amazing monks were produced, at least in modern Thailand. Ancient Thailand, I don't know. Produced with not much. And it's because there is these two types of powers, these two types of directions you can go. Buddhism, we don't often talk about good and evil, weighing the good and evil. But in terms of our actual practice itself, what's good to notice is these patterns. That there is this pattern that starts big, that promises big, and delivers small. There is this pattern that starts small, almost promises, well, not promises, but what you can see, at least your imagination of what you're going to get from doing these things. You can't imagine, well, maybe a little bit more than what I've got now, but it starts small and grows actually very large. It over-delivers. Under-promises and over-delivers. Now this second portion is where strength comes from. Strength in an individual, strength in a person's, you might call in their house, strength in a society. And what you tend to see in societies at large, when you look at history, is that often what you'll see, or sometimes at least what you'll see, is this time period when that society had almost nothing. And they were forced, because of having almost nothing, they couldn't grasp onto this type of, pattern that's like a slide. In other words, you hop on the top and it takes you right to the bottom. They had to go on this pattern that's like a ladder. Maybe I should have said a snake. You got the snakes and it's like a snake. You play snakes and ladders. Hop on the snake, it takes you to the bottom. They had to grasp onto this pattern that's like a ladder where they have to sit there and climb each rung. Climb, 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 climb. But when they get to the top, there's a snake. Saying, oh, the fruit is really good. You can be a little bit unjust to your neighbors. You can conquer these other people. And when they start to conquer these other nations, the same justifications that they use to oppress people outside start to be used to oppress people inside. Now, that society can become cynical. And once that society becomes cynical, virtue in that society ceases to be a real pursuit for people. It ceases to be a real means by which people are elected to office or, rise to office, whatever office it is, king or president. It ceases to be a real standard by which people judge their success, judge who's worthy of emulation, judge who's worthy of leadership. And one of the reasons for this that's very interesting is because these external things that were built up when people were heedful don't fall away right away. It takes time. There's a time lag between when people start to lose these principles and when the external things go. What you see in history is that when these nations tend to reach the height of their power, at least in some cases, they start to go out and grab these things, evil things they do to their neighbors. They start doing evil things to their people. Evil people start to rise to office. The whole system becomes cynical. That society loses its strength. That society no longer is able to withstand adversity, no longer able to gel together to overcome trials and tribulations. They just get used to this endless consumption, this kind of easy life, and this kind of society gets built around that. The interesting thing about the way that this graphs is because just like Eve with the apple, it's like, yeah, go grab the apple or whatever, or, whoever it is, whatever temptation it might be in whatever story. When you go to grab the apple, you don't even get the apple sometimes. In other words, It promised so much. You thought you were, it seems like one is going to have not only the apple, another garden that's just as good, maybe grow one's own apple tree, and one ends up with neither the apple or the apple tree or the garden. This is the way that these temptations graph. They promise things in the mind like this. Whether it's a real being, like a Mara, whether it's a person's greed, they promise this. Yeah, another sub won't be so bad, just one more. Yeah, it's okay, it's only been a year that I've been smoking. It won't be too hard to quit. Promise these things. What ends up happening with these societies is that they lose not only the resilience and ability to withstand external invasion, to overcome tribulations, they lose all the wealth that they were staring at as a true measure of their power, as a true measure of their success. They're staring at this wealth. Well, wait a minute, our virtue's gone, things are, but we still got this. And in the end, it's all gone. So the nice thing about this, as mentioned, is that these things actually go two ways. They graph in this way where they go down, and they graph in this way where they go up. So this is why when we come to meditation, it's important to realize that this is a skill which goes up. It's not a skill that's like eating a Twinkie, not a skill that's like, I don't know, whatever one's eating a sub or going to a party. It doesn't start big and go small. It starts small and goes big. Now, these type of things that graph this way are nice because one of the things about them is that you actually don't require much at all. I think I read this passage in the canon one time, which I have not been able to find since, but should ask a learned monk about it. And it was this passage that said, there's nothing that can obstruct somebody who wants to perfect generosity from doing so. Now, whether or not that was like some quote that I read somewhere, or it's actually in the canon, I can't say for sure, but I always liked it. Okay, whether or not it's 100% true or whatever, there's truth to it. There's truth in it. If it's in the canon, then you can take that as the word of the Buddha. But one of the interesting things about it is you think, wait a minute, a person has like nothing, how can they perfect generosity? A person has like their shirt on their back and their shoes and, maybe like a hat and like in the old days they'd have this fishing pole with like a little bag at the end. That was like a sign of being homeless. Nowadays monks have this bag, I think in Sinhalese they call it a potaniya, So that's sometimes what you hear. But in any event, you think about the way this works. You just have these few possessions. How is it possible for a person to perfect generosity in this situation? And one of the reasons for this is that these things that go up, not go down, actually the things that go down, the basis for this is them too. The basis of them is intention. In other words, when a person gives a small gift, or even if a person has nothing, what the Buddha says is even if it's a person's last meal, if a person knew the results of giving and sharing, like he knew the results of giving and sharing, they probably wouldn't eat that, they wouldn't let the stain of stinginess obsess their minds. In other words, they wouldn't eat without having given. And so long as we have a grain of rice, you can cut that in half if there's one more person. There was this other time when there's other interesting things about this. Let me just see how much time I have so I don't go on too long, because I've got maybe 10 more. Oh, wait a minute. 50. 40. Oh, okay. Well, I think I'm actually almost done. So I'll wrap it up in 5-6 minutes. But try to get out some maybe a couple more of these stories from the canon, which are kind of interesting. But one of the things about the way these things graph is that although people have almost nothing, when a person shares these things, it's not like they're poor. That's actually a sign of wealth, is that one is able to give things away. When one is poor, one can't give anything away. So there can be a person with many possessions, very poor, can't afford to give anything away. A person very poor is also very rich. They don't have many possessions, but they're very wealthy. They can afford to give much away. Now, there's interesting things about the way that this graphs too, because when a person gives many things away like this, their mind becomes bright. This is where a lot of happiness comes from. And this is where a person starts to climb up the ladder. And there's mysterious things about the way these things operate. So it's said when a person practices giving, that's when they put in place the kamma for wealth. In other words, when a person has nothing, they practice this generosity, things sometimes come together for them. Now, this is something that can be hard to believe with a scientific background, but there are cases where it happens. Kind of just unusual. And if the day comes when you deliberately take on this practice and it happens to you, you sometimes get the sense, I think this is coming from this thing that I did. This just came together out of nowhere. Then you start to get faith in these principles. So this is something that builds larger. Generosity builds larger. Virtue builds larger. The thing about these things is that when a person has very little things, this delusion comes up. I've got no money, I can't give. The world is too corrupt, I can't be virtuous. I have no time, I can't meditate. The amazing thing about this, unlike the first type of graph, where it tells us this things like, oh, you're going to have all this stuff, it's going to be great, nothing. With this one, the mind tells you, the Mara, the devil, the snake, tells you, oh, it's going to be impossible for you to do, you're never going to be able to accomplish it. And, interestingly enough, things come together. Person leaves the Philippines, comes to Canada, ends up with a citizenship. I can say that. Wants to go to Afghanistan to do good, somehow ends up with an offer for a job. Very interesting, isn't it? Now, this is the kind of thing that happens when a person starts building to do good. Not that they seek it, like, where is it? Come on now. I gave, 10 alms meals, where's my money? These kind of things ripen like a flower does, You keep watering them, you don't know when they'll ripen, but if you plant the seeds and water them, the day comes when they grow, when they bear fruit. And when they bear fruit in a person's mind, that's when they know these things for themselves. They gain this kind of strength. They gain this kind of resilience because what they have is a happiness that doesn't depend on these things that are subject to change as much. Doesn't have the fears that come when one grabs onto the things that bring temptation. If one has 10 apples, there's only 10. But when it comes to good qualities like generosity, the more we give, the more other people benefit. The more other people give, the more we benefit. In other words, it goes in the complete opposite direction of these other qualities. Now, if there were no type of pattern that graphed this way, starting small and going up, it wouldn't be possible for us to practice. It wouldn't be possible for us to practice. It would be very difficult for us to practice if there was no pattern like this. No pattern of things that started small and went big. But there is such a pattern. And because there's this pattern, because there's this opportunity to develop things in this way, we always have this chance to make our minds happy. We always have this chance to move forward in our meditation. There's nothing that can stop one who's intent on perfecting generosity from perfecting it. There's nothing that can stop a person, well, other than bad karma, all these various things, a person who's determined things come together for them in the end, they will be able to achieve even the highest goal, so long as they don't stop. So this is the nice thing about the Buddha's teachings. It doesn't require much of us in terms of our possessions. It doesn't require much of us in terms of our fame. It doesn't require much in terms of our status. In fact, it goes the opposite way of those things. Those things come later. When a person is rich in wholesome qualities, they show up like the snake. Okay, why don't you give up? Stop doing this, stop practicing. You can go enjoy a good life. But so long as one perseveres, because there's this way that these things graph, there's this opposite direction that things can take, where they start small and build big, we can always have the opportunity to find a happiness inside. We can always have the opportunity to build this basis in our mind, and even on our deathbed, we can practice for Nibbana.